She stopped for a quick errand and never came back. On the night of October 23rd, 2019, Aniah Blanchard was doing something completely ordinary. She left her apartment, telling her roommate she'd be right back. No fear, no urgency, no sign that anything was wrong. Just a normal night. At 19 years old, Aniah had her life ahead of her. She was a college student in Alabama, focused, independent, determined, the kind of person who had plans, the kind of person who didn't just disappear. That night, she got into her car and drove to a convenience store in Auburn, a familiar place. Bright lights, people coming and going, safe, or at least it should have been. Surveillance cameras captured her walking inside. Calm, relaxed, she moved through the aisles, picked out what she needed, and paid at the counter. Nothing about her behavior stood out. No hesitation, no sign of distress. Just another customer on another night. Then she walked back outside. And that's where everything changed. Because from that moment on, no one would ever see her again. At first, no one realized anything was wrong. An hour passed. Then two. Her roommate tried calling. No answer. Text messages were sent. No reply. Maybe she got distracted. Maybe she ran into someone. But as the night stretched on, that explanation stopped making sense. By morning, something felt off. This wasn't like her. Aniah was responsible. She stayed in touch. She didn't just vanish without telling anyone. Concern turned into worry. Worry turned into fear. Her family was contacted. And that's when the reality began to set in. She was missing. Authorities were notified and a report was filed. But from the very beginning, this case felt different. Because when investigators began retracing her steps, they noticed something disturbing. She never made it back to her car. Think about that. She walked out of a well-lit store, in a public place, and vanished in the space of a few steps. That detail changed everything. This wasn't someone who left voluntarily. This wasn't someone who decided to disappear. Something had happened, right there in that parking lot. Investigators returned to the scene. They searched every inch of the area, looking for anything that could explain what happened. And then they found it. Blood. Not a small amount. Not something you could dismiss. There were clear signs of a struggle, right outside the store, in a place people walk past every day. A place that, just hours earlier, had seemed completely normal. That discovery confirmed their worst fears. Aniah hadn't just gone missing. She had been taken. From that moment, everything escalated. Search teams were deployed. Law enforcement began working around the clock. Time mattered now more than ever, because in cases like this, the first 48 hours can mean the difference between life and death. Investigators started piecing together her final movements. They reviewed surveillance footage, not just from the store, but from surrounding areas. They tracked her phone, analyzed data, looked for anything that didn't belong. And slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Witnesses came forward. Some had been at the store that night. Others had passed through the area. And a few of them remembered something unusual. A man, someone who didn't seem to fit. Descriptions were vague, but consistent enough to matter. He wasn't just another customer. There was something about him, something that stood out. Investigators took those details and began digging deeper. And then they found a name, Ibrahim Yazid. He wasn't unknown to law enforcement. Far from it. He had a history, a violent one, charges that immediately raised red flags. And at the time Aniah disappeared, he wasn't supposed to be in a position to hurt anyone, because he had already been arrested before. but he was out on bond. That detail changed everything, because it meant one thing. He had been given a second chance, and now he was being connected to something far worse. Investigators began tracking his movements, where he had been, who he had spoken to, what he had done that night. Surveillance footage from the area revealed a vehicle, a car that appeared around the same time Aniah disappeared. A car investigators believed was connected to him. Witness statements started lining up, timelines matched, and the pieces began falling into place. But the more they uncovered, the more disturbing the case became. Evidence suggested that Aniah had been forced into a vehicle, against her will, in a matter of seconds, in a place where anyone could have seen, but no one realized what was happening. That's how quickly everything can change. One moment, you're walking to your car. The next, you're gone. A statewide alert was issued. Law enforcement across Alabama and beyond joined the search. They weren't just looking for Aniah anymore. They were looking for the man they believed had taken her. Meanwhile, her family waited. Every hour felt heavier than the last. Every phone call carried hope and fear. Her mother spoke publicly, desperate, heartbroken, pleading for answers, for help, for anything that could bring her daughter home. The case quickly spread. News outlets picked it up. Social media amplified it. People across the country began following the story, hoping for good news. But behind the scenes, investigators were uncovering something else, something that made the situation even more urgent. The suspect was gone. He had fled, left the area, which meant two things. He knew he was being hunted, and he was trying to escape. A manhunt began. Law enforcement agencies coordinated across state lines. Every lead mattered. Every sighting was investigated. Time was running out. Days passed, and still no sign of Aniah. The longer she remained missing, the more the reality began to sink in. Because in cases like this, time doesn't just pass. It works against you. And yet, there was still hope, because they had something most cases don't. A suspect, a direction, evidence. But what investigators were about to uncover next would change everything. Because finding him wouldn't mean saving her. It would mean facing the truth about what had already been done. The search for Aniah Blanchard didn't slow down, it intensified. Because now investigators weren't just looking for a missing person. They were chasing someone who was running. And the longer Ibrahim Yazid stayed ahead, the harder it would be to piece together what happened in those missing hours after she vanished from that parking lot. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states were pulled in, patrol units alerted, highways monitored, and every tip, no matter how small, was taken. Seriously, because in a case like this, even the smallest detail could be the one that changes everything. Reports started coming in from different locations, sightings at places miles away from where the disappearance happened, which meant he wasn't hiding nearby. He was moving constantly, trying to stay one step ahead, and that told investigators something important. He knew what he had done, and he knew they were coming for him. Then came the break they had been waiting for. A vehicle linked to him was spotted, not in Alabama, but across state lines in Florida. And that single development shifted the entire direction of the investigation, because now this was a search with no clear path. This was a target pursuit. Law enforcement moved quickly, coordinating across jurisdictions, tracking movements, narrowing down locations, and when they finally found him, it happened fast. He was taken into custody without incident. The manhunt was over, but the silence around what happened to Aniah only grew louder. Because even though they had a man they believed was responsible, they still didn't have her. And that absence carried a weight that no arrest could fix. investigators began questioning him, pressing for answers, trying to understand what happened after that moment in the parking lot. What happened when she was forced into that vehicle, where he took her, what he did next. But the truth didn't come easily. Details were incomplete, timelines blurred, and some answers remained just out of reach. Meanwhile, the search for Aniah continued, methodical and relentless. Teams combed through wooded areas, searched isolated locations, followed every possible lead. Volunteers joined in, people who had never met her but felt connected to her story. Because something about it stayed with you. The idea that someone could disappear in such a small window of time, in a place that felt so ordinary. And as days passed, that initial urgency slowly shifted into something heavier. Hope was still there, but it wasn't as strong as it had been before. It became quieter, more fragile. And then weeks later, everything changed. Human remains were discovered in a wooded area, not far from where the investigation had been focused. The scene was secured immediately. Investigators moved carefully, documenting everything, because now every detail mattered more than ever. And then came the confirmation. The remains were identified as Aniah, and just like that, the search ended in a way no one had wanted. The hope that she might still be found alive was gone, replaced by a reality that was far harder to accept for her family. This was the moment everything shifted. The waiting, the uncertainty, the constant checking of phones, the belief that she might still come home, all of it collapsed into a single devastating truth. She wasn't coming back. And what remained were questions that don't have easy answers. Investigators now focus on building the case, because finding her was only one part of it. They needed to prove exactly what happened, piece by piece. Evidence began forming a clearer picture, surveillance footage placing him in the area, witness accounts supporting the timeline, forensic findings connecting the events, each detail reinforcing the same conclusion. Prosecutors moved forward. Charges were filed, and the case entered the courtroom, where everything would be examined. Every moment leading up to her disappearance, every action that followed, laid out in front of the jury. But even in court, not everything could be fully explained, because some parts of what happened that night existed only between two people, one of whom could no longer speak, and the other who wasn't given a full story. And through it all, one detail kept coming back into focus. Something that made the case even more unsettling. Yazid had been out on bond. He had already faced serious charges before, and yet he was free. On the night Aniah disappeared, which raised a question that lingered beyond the courtroom, beyond the investigation. A question that people still ask when they hear this story. Could this have been prevented? It's not a simple question, and it doesn't have a simple answer, but it's one that adds another layer to an already tragic case, because it speaks to something bigger than just one moment. The trial brought renewed attention to Aniah's life, not just the way it ended, but who she was. Before all of this, a young woman with plans, with goals, with a future that was taken in a matter of moments. And eventually, a verdict was reached, a decision made within the justice system, accountability in a legal sense. But even with that, the outcome didn't erase what had happened. It didn't undo the loss. It didn't bring back the life that was taken. Because some things can't be fixed, they can only be remembered. And that's what cases like this leave behind. Not just facts, not just timelines, but a story that stays with you. A reminder of how quickly something ordinary can turn into something irreversible. Aniah walked into that store like anyone else would, expecting to leave and continue her night. But she never got that chance. And the only thing left now is her story, a story that continues to be told so that she isn't forgotten, so that what happened isn't reduced to just another headline. And if hearing this made you stop and think, even for a moment, then take A. Second, to subscribe to Dark Truth, unsolved cases like this video, and share it with someone else. Because the more people who hear stories like this, the harder it becomes for them to be forgotten, and sometimes that's the only way the truth keeps living on.